Hello, and welcome to The Issue. I'm your host, Emily Walsh Martin. Today, I had the honor of speaking to Brendan Hayes, Senior Director of Education and Innovative Therapies at the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation, formerly known as the National Hemophilia Foundation. Today, we're going to dive into how patient communities shape the development of new therapies, the historical context that influences decision-making in clinical trials, and the unique considerations facing those who might choose to pursue cell and gene therapies. I hope you'll stick around for an illuminating conversation about trust, innovation, and the power of patient advocacy in advancing cell and gene therapies. Importantly, you can also hear Brendan in a panel discussion entitled The Journey from Early Stage Trials to Approval at ASGCT's Empowering Patients 2025 Cell and Gene Therapy Virtual Summit. Hosted live on March 12th and 13th, you can register for this free patient-centered virtual event by visiting asgct.org/EP2025. And now, my conversation with Brendan Hayes. Brendan Hayes, thank you so much for joining us on The Issue today. I know in a few weeks here, you're going to be joining the Empowering Patients 2025 virtual summit that the ASGCT is holding on March 12th and 13th. You're on a panel that's going to cover the journey from early stage trials to approval. But I'm just happy that we have the chance to connect ahead of that symposium and maybe do a deep dive about the work you do and the community that you serve. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah. So why don't we just start at the top? Could you share a little bit about your background and how you found your way to your current role at the National Bleeding Disorder Foundation?
Yeah, well, it's funny. It never ends up being the way that we think it's going to be, right? When we're in school and we graduate and we get that first job and everything unfolds, it never works out the way that we think it's going to. So I'm definitely a great example of that. So I was in information technology before I joined the nonprofit world, which it's a very odd thing to be in something like that, have that sort of that business background, that technology background, and then all of a sudden you're over in nonprofit. So, I think that realistically, the reason why I moved over was because I have two adult sons with severe hemophilia, and that really changed my life. I think that, looking back, I really wanted to stay in technology and continue to progress in my career. But it became evident that there were a lot of opportunities in the nonprofit world. And also, I think it was really cool for me because I was able to see things that I could do to really make a difference in other people's lives. And so that's what really drew me in. I ended up starting in the nonprofit world like a lot of people. I volunteered with our local chapter. I was on the board of directors for a while. And then they had an opening for the executive director role. And I was asked to think about taking that on. And I did. And it was really life-changing for me to be able to serve the community in that way, not just be a parent, but actually look at the community from a broader perspective and understand what the needs were, how diverse the community was, or is, I should say. And it was a really great experience. I did that for about 5 years. And one of the things that I discovered was that I had this passion for advocacy work. And prior to having that job, I never really thought about talking to a policymaker. It never really crossed my mind, but that was something that I really enjoyed. We have two chapters, two organizations that support bleeding disorders in the state of Texas. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to have one voice. So the two chapters came together and we created the Texas Bleeding Disorders Coalition.
Mm.
And that sounds like something really simple to do, but when you have two organizations that have different missions, focuses, even though they're serving the same community of people, it's a big deal to come together. And so we were actually able to get some pretty important legislation passed, which is a really big deal in Texas. So that was something that we were really excited about. And at that 4.5, 5 year point, I started thinking out what more can I do? And an opportunity became available at the National Hemophilia Foundation. It was for a government relations. It was a government relations role. And so I have been at NBDF for almost 10 years now. And the thing that's been really cool for me in this at this organization is we transitioned from the National Hemophilia Foundation to the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation a couple of years ago, and that's really exciting because we're now serving more of our community. So I think it isn't just about hemophilia. There are many bleeding disorders that we were serving, and now we are ensuring that everyone knows that they have a place, that they have a home. And so that's something that we're all really excited about. In this role, I started off in government relations, doing policy and advocacy work. And then I went on to do some stakeholder relations activities, especially around this gene therapy space. So all of a sudden, this concept of gene therapy started to become a reality. If I look back and think about those first appointments that I had with my oldest son when we went to our hemophilia treatment center, it was interesting because they kept telling me, this is going to all work out. It's going to be great. We're going to have a cure for hemophilia by the time your son is 16. Well, my son is 29 and we don't have a cure yet, but we're continuing to get closer to that. So we really started to see, this gene therapy thing, this is something it's starting to take off and we need to take this seriously. And prior to gene therapy, really, we had one major type of treatment and it was factor replacement therapy. Then right before the gene therapy explosion, as I'll call it, we have a bispecific antibody therapy also.
Right.
So that was really life-changing for people because we went from having the IV therapy, the intravenous, so people had to start their own IVs, to a sub-Q stick, which was really life-changing. But that was only for hemophilia A patients.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that was really unique about gene therapy for the hemophilia community at the time is that, we have all these different types of factor replacement therapy.
Right.
So I think consumers were of the mindset that, if this therapy isn't working or something new comes along that works a little bit better, I'm going to give it a try. The thing that's interesting about gene therapy, which your audience is very well aware of, is you can't undo it. And so
Right.
this is a concept that I think was eye-opening for people, and it's something that we were very focused on ensuring that people understood.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about this because it takes me back to basically the starting point of my own career in gene and cell therapy about 10 years ago. I actually attended one of the National Hemophilia Foundation's events, and I think what struck me at that event, because I was working on early stages of a novel gene therapy in that space, what was amazing in that event was to hear the community, how in-depth and knowledgeable they were about, not just their own current therapy, but the other therapies out there. And you sort of mentioned this, like they're civilian scientists, if you will, like who are studying their own conditions and are very, very aware of what's out there and know what would be a breakthrough for themselves. And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, how patients, or how you've seen patients in your community sort of comparison shop, if you will. Because early on, I just, full transparency, like early on, when there were parts of our team who, when we thought about our target product profile for our gene therapy, they were just comparing against other gene therapies. And one of the things after I went to the NHF event, I came back and was like, no, 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 we gotta look bigger. We gotta think about, everything that's out there and compare to that, because these are incredibly, intelligent folks who are digging deep into the scientific data and understand and want to understand their choices. So I'd love to hear your experience, in your education role, maybe being part of the system that helps them think through these options.
That's a really great point. I think that we have a history in our community of advocacy, of storytelling. We have people who I always say that we have the smartest consumer population. We have people who have dedicated their lives to learning about bleeding disorders as well.
Mm.
And this is a so-called cradle to grave disorder. So people do have a lot of time to get their hands around, understand, research, all of those things. And if you think about factor replacement therapy, up until recently, some people have had their whole lives to learn about that therapy. And then all of a sudden, these new things are coming along fast and furiously. So, what we wanted to do at the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation was to ensure that the educational materials that we created were accessible for people so that they really could learn and understand not only how the therapy works, but what the risks and benefits of these therapies are, and what might they be gaining or sacrificing by jumping into some of these therapies. And so we also knew that there was some number of folks in our community who were starting to look at gene therapy via a clinical trial. And so again, this was way before we got to the point where we were ready to really start educating the general population. So we did all we could to ensure that we had materials out there well in advance of an FDA approval, which I
Mm.
think was really helpful. And I think something else that I'm very proud of is that we actually pulled our community in to help us figure these things out. We work very closely with the physicians in our community, those hemophilia treatment center docs that are so beloved, and they were instrumental in helping us create content. We also included our patient community as well because, again, you want to make sure that the information that you are creating resonates with them.
Mhm.
Does this really make sense? What more do you want to know? What are some unanswered questions? So, we really kind of went at it at a lens of let's make sure that we're doing the right thing for the right folks. And we also, again, wanted to make sure that the content was accessible. We wanted to have a diversity, a health equity perspective to ensure that we had content in Spanish as well. And so it was a really big job, but we wanted we wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable too. I don't know if you've had this experience or not, Emily, but have you ever been in front of someone who you perceived as being smarter than you? And
Mm.
you hesitated to ask a question because you were like, "Oh, geez, I don't want to seem like I have no clue is what's going on, right?" So
Mhm.
one of the things that we did that I think was a fun activity was we created a resource, questions for your provider. So it was a little card that they could take in, and these are sort of pre-vetted questions. So, hey, it's
Right.
okay for me to ask this question. So, we created videos, a very simplistic what is gene therapy video that I actually wanted my mom to be able to watch this video and
Yeah.
understand gene therapy for a condition that her grandchildren had, right? So we looked at it. We wanted small children to watch the video and have an understanding of what gene therapy was. So it's pretty simplistic, but I think it hit the mark with a lot of people. But then we also knew that we had parts of our community who they really wanted to get down into the weeds. And so we tried to make sure that we were creating content for those folks as well. So we have a lot of recorded videos, basically we recorded a lot of presentations. The bad thing about COVID is that we couldn't spend a lot of time together, but the positive thing was we have some amazing recorded content that we likely wouldn't have had had
Right.
we not had the opportunity to do so many webinars. So we've got, webinars where physicians are presenting content as well. So, yeah, we tried to sort of look at the educational perspective from different angles. And then the goal being that we wanted people to make educated decisions. We wanted to have them be as knowledgeable as possible because, again, you can't undo this therapy, as we
Yeah.
know. And the pace of innovation is overwhelming for many. And so I think the other piece, too, that was really important is understanding that this is a process. So the therapies that we have today are going to be very, very different than what we're going to have in 10 years. And
Right.
understanding what that means in terms of your ability to have different therapies in the future. So we wanted to make sure that people weren't making decisions in a vacuum. They had all the information in order to make the right decision, for their particular circumstance. And so that's sort of how we went at this problem.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing that struck me at that event about a decade ago was I felt like there were still ripples, right, from the batch blood HIV things that the community went through, in the I guess 80s, and I'm curious, how do you see those ripples yourself in the work that you're doing, and how do you find that those ripples are changing how the community sort of sees their role in their own therapies?
Yeah, so if you would allow me to take just a moment here to just talk a little bit about this history in our community that's so important. I just want to make sure that all the listeners are aware, if that's
Please,
okay.
yes. Like I
Um,
grew up with it. And so I was aware, because there were articles even in 17 magazine when I was young, right?
yeah.
But not everyone who listens to this podcast will be as aware. So please
Yeah.
take your time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can remember learning about this HIV AIDS crisis. I remember seeing news stories about a young man named Ryan White.
Yep.
And this was way before I, had my own children. So that was something that, I think a lot of people will remember. But specifically back in the 80s, this HIV AIDS crisis erupted, and it really did impact the bleeding disorders community. We actually lost a whole generation of men and boys, and they became infected with this virus because the medication that they were using had a blood component, and it wasn't treated effectively. So again, this tainted blood situation erupted into a crisis for the community. And what was interesting too is that these medications that the community were taking, this factor replacement product, at that time, it was this is the new awesome thing. This is going to be life-changing. This
Hmm.
is an amazing. You don't have to go and get whole blood or cryoprecipitate. This is amazing, right? People were so excited having the ability to do treatments at home, not having to be connected to a treatment for hours on end. I mean, this was really life-changing. But unfortunately, the products were, the blood product was tainted. So this really set up a situation where our community is very distrustful of pharmaceutical companies, of new technology, right? So that was something that I think we really had to understand about gene therapy. And I
Yeah.
think we're still trying to unpack that a little bit. But I think that, there were certainly positives that came out of this situation. And I think really what I learned is that, looking back, the disorders community, they're just amazing advocates. And we're a small rare disease community, but we're mighty. And, I think that if I look back to the 80s when all of this was happening, all the way up to 2025, I think the thing that really resonates is that we are watchdogs. We ensure that our products are safe. I'm very proud of the work that we do, our policy team does at NBDF to ensure that the blood supply remains safe. And that's something that benefits all of us, not just people with bleeding disorders. Because at any point in time, we may all need to have, a blood product. So, I think you always try to have to look at the silver linings. However, I think yes, there were positives that came out of a really horrific situation, but we as a community maintain a very watchful eye, and we're very skeptical of new things, new treatment options. So I think that's something that has been interesting for me to watch unfold in this space.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me, it goes from the concept of, the doctor saying, trust me, or the pharmacist saying, trust me, or the pharmaceutical company saying, trust me, to the patient sort of saying, no, 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 show me, like, show me the data, show me why you believe that this is a good option for me. And I think from my perspective, that's a message I want all of our teams to have who are working on novel gene and cell therapies in the space. We need to be able to really show people why there might be benefit, why there might be risk, and help them to make good decisions. And obviously, one of the places that patients are making decisions, yes or no, is in the context of a clinical trial. And I'm curious how the NBDF, like, do you guys get involved in sort of helping patients think through possible clinical trials? How do you guys interact with your community around clinical trials, especially for things like gene therapies and the sort of one and done, cuts both ways? Yes, it might be just one one injection for the rest of your life, but then if there's something new down the line, you may not be able to have that until we figure out how to redose, right?
Yeah. I think another piece too is that there are so many unanswered questions about gene therapy, right?
Yeah.
We're definitely learning more every day, but there are still some things that we just don't have answers to. And I think that's something that's it's not, it's, people don't like that. We all want the answers before we jump off the high dive, so to speak. So, in terms of clinical trials, we work with both the community and our pharma partners to ensure the voice of the community is embedded in clinical trials for bleeding disorders. We do several things. First off, I wanted to highlight our virtual advisory panels, or VAPs. These are hosted and facilitated by NBDF with pharma companies, and we include our lived experience experts as panelists. And they discuss a variety of topics, including clinical trials, so that pharma has a deeper understanding of patient needs. So that's one thing I want to highlight. We're also fortunate to provide grants to researchers and scientists, and we ask that they include the voice of lived experience experts in all stages of their research. So again, that's one other way. Within our community voices in research, patient registry. It's a patient-driven registry. We're building a clinical trials finder or clinical trial connector to provide participants easier access to what they might be eligible for based on the info that they actually put into the Community Voices and Research Registry, which is, I think, unique to the bleeding disorders community because we have so many different bleeding disorders, so many different trials going on at any given point in time. I think it's really confusing for patients. And what's cool about the Community Voices and Research Registry is that it enables you as a patient to put in all of your information, and then you're able to learn more about your bleeding disorder. You're able to learn about what's happening with other people with the same bleeding disorder. And you actually, I think another thing that's cool about it too is that oftentimes we end up hearing from the same patients, those expert patients in the community. The thing that's cool here is that we're able to have access to consumers, patients all over the country. And so think about those rural families that don't get to participate in these kinds of things. We're actually able to hear their voice as well. So that's a really powerful tool. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the educational stuff that we do. So we have education workshops on clinical trials, helping people again understand a little bit more about the different phases, what their responsibilities are, because we want people to have all the information they need, not on just the actual gene therapy, for example, or product, or treatment, but we also want them to understand all of the details behind how clinical trials work and where they fit into that. And again, we do our best through education, to ensure that that patient voice is heard. One of the things that was really interesting to me, I'm really lucky. I get to talk to people who've had gene therapy, and that is something that I just love about my job. And, it's something that, I am just so grateful for, because these are pioneers. How
Yeah.
often do you get to talk to a pioneer, right? And these are people who, oftentimes are making decisions because they're looking at it from a philanthropic perspective. I want to give back to the community. This community has done so much for me. I want to be able to give back. I think the thing that was fascinating to me is talking to different people. I was so surprised that we had some folks who are of the younger generation, let's say. So folks that are in their 20s that were doing, gene therapy through a clinical trial. And when I asked questions like, did you understand the process? What about informed consent? Did you understand that process? And they're like, what are you talking about?
Hmm.
And, what I discovered was, I think they were so trusting that
Hmm.
they may not have read everything with, that really fine lens. And so they had questions afterwards that they probably would have appreciated answers ahead of time. But I think that's something that we take very seriously. So we stress that in our educational materials. We talk
Yeah.
about the importance of really, understanding the process, asking questions, understanding that, at any stage of the process, if you don't feel comfortable, you can back out. So yeah, that's what we did. We really focused on that, making sure
Yeah.
we were educated on the process.
Well, and that's something, it's interesting to hear you say that, because that's something that in my role on teams, I often worry a lot about is the informed consent process, because a lot of work goes into crafting those, right? With
Absolutely.
the internal company team and then the PIs, sometimes giving feedback to make sure it's understandable to their patients, or likely to be understandable. But at the end of the day, it's complicated, right? Because on the one hand, there's this promise of this shiny new gene therapy that might do something magical for a patient. And then there's like 20 pages of words in an informed
Right.
consent that even if they are written at the right level that anyone can read them, you want to hope that the key points are landing and that people truly do feel like they're in the driver's seat when they say yes. I'm curious, do you have advice for companies who are crafting those informed consents to how to make them better so that patients do take the driver's seat as they consider joining a trial?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind for me is gamification.
Mm.
Instead of it being a piece of paper or, 20-page document, I mean, I think sometimes they're electronic, but is there some way to engage the person in the content more? I think that would be really important. Uh,
Mm.
rather than just say, "Hey, read this thing and sign it." And again,
Right.
I'm generalizing, I know, but finding ways to get them more engaged in the content, that's something that I think that, is really important to educators.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never even considered that. That's a like even if it was just asking questions to confirm their understanding of key salient points right before
Exactly.
they sign, that's very interesting. Because you're right, like at the end of the day, there's so many unknowns. And in particular for people who are, in the first cohort, let's say, of a clinical trial in phase one, where dose has not been identified, right? Who might not receive a dose high enough to ensure that they have a meaningful benefit.
Mhm.
I think it's really crucial that we don't the ICF shouldn't be a chore on the company side. It should be something we think intensely about and also figure out how to engage the patient, as you're saying.
Yeah, and I think consumers that are ready to do gene therapy, they're ready to go.
Right.
Don't make me read all these forms. I want to do this thing, right? I think that's another piece of this too.
Yeah.
Um, but I think at the end of the day, it's all our responsibilities, to ensure that that's something that, that people really do understand the importance of the process and the ability to ask questions. I'll kind of get back to that point that I made earlier about, people don't want to don't want to ask questions. They feel uncomfortable, right? So what kind of an environment can we create in the clinic that creates that comfort level so that people can ask whatever question they might have? I think certainly some people if I think about the different age groups in our community too, I think that's something also that the people
Mm.
who are older have gone through so much, and I think they are super careful about all the things. Where you have the younger generation who've had this factor replacement therapy that's been safe. Some of them may not have even had a bleed or a serious bleed, which is unbelievable.
Right.
They're thinking, oh, I'm sure that, I've heard things like, my physician is, they're going to make sure that, this is the right thing for me to do. I've heard all kinds of different things. And so, I mean, it's a really important concept. And that's another piece that we really stress with people in terms of making this really important decision is research. Make sure you get your questions answered. Make sure you go out and read and learn as much as you can. The good, the bad, the ugly. Talk to other people. One of the things that has been really interesting in our community is the importance of community. And so, we talk about the different ways people learn. Our community just loves to talk to each other, and they so enjoy having the ability to talk to people about different treatment options. While I recognize that that's a little dangerous for people who aren't, physicians to talk about treatment options, people do learn a lot about them. And knowing that, one of the things that was really important for me to do at NBDF was to create an environment where we could bring people together that have had these therapies alongside physicians and have conversations that people could take part in. And so we call them candid conversations.
Mm.
And, we have the very first one we had was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and we had consumers who were on factor replacement therapy, bispecific antibody therapy, and then gene therapy. And we had a physician moderate that panel, and they talked about where they were in the spectrum of being, being interested in gene therapy, why they were using the particular treatment option that they were using, the individual who had gene therapy, what was it that made him want to do that? Take that step and through a clinical trial. So we've continued to have those conversations at our bleeding disorders conference every year. And, we had a situation, one of the ones that I really enjoyed was we actually had a consumer, a patient who had had gene therapy. He was the moderator, and he
Mm.
moderated a panel of physicians to learn about what do you really think about gene therapy. It was fascinating. It was really cool.
I
But
love that.
we've continued to have them every year at our Bleeding Disorders Conference. They're wildly popular, standing room only. And we started to think we need to get this out to our local chapters. So we created something last year called Candid Conversations on the Road.
Mm.
And we were able to go out to 4 chapters across the country, connect them with people who've had gene therapy and or are on some of the newer therapies like ultra half-life products and bispecific antibody therapy, and just talk about their experience. And I think that's another great way for people to learn too about the importance of gene therapy. Now, when you think about it too, I think you can learn a lot from people who have had great experiences with gene therapy, but you can also learn a lot from people who have not had great experiences, because that can create an environment for you to be able to ask those really important and tough questions.
Yeah.
I talked to someone who didn't have a great outcome, it didn't work for him. What might this look like for me? And then, I think another piece too, which is so fascinating, I think we think about medications like we're going to take a pill and it's going to work, right?
Mm.
And, you and I are both going to take acetaminophen and it's going to work the same. It's going to get rid of our headache and we're not going to even think twice about it. Well, we know gene therapy is not that way. It works in some and not in others, and it works differently in different people too. That's a concept that people are struggling to get their head around, I think, from a consumer perspective, because again, they're used to, I'm going to I'm going to take my factor replacement therapy and I know exactly, what my level is going to be, how long my half-life is. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a completely different concept. Yeah.
Well, and I have to say, I'm so glad you said that because I think early on, I think our industry did an amazing job of when we would display data from clinical trials, we would have swim lanes and it would be one for each patient. And you could sort of see, okay, some patients, great response, some patients less so, some patients, nothing at all, right? And we seem, and I don't want to critique my colleagues, but I will. We seem to be moving away from those kinds of presentations and instead presenting average responses with, whiskers
Hmm.
on the, upper and lower boundaries. And I don't think that that is as digestible for the average person. I think the average person is better at sort of seeing those swim lane type approaches and understanding, oh, okay, no, this, mileage does vary.
Right.
I might be, that guy at the top of the bar with greater than 20% factor levels, but I might not.
Hmm.
And I think that that is maybe something we should get back to as an industry in thinking about, the consumers of this data aren't just your other colleagues developing drugs, but they're also going to be the patients who have to self-inform about whether or not this is the right option for them.
Absolutely. And I think, mentioning factor levels, I think that is so interesting too. I know that was another piece of this gene therapy puzzle when we started to really dive into understanding, how we wanted to present information to the community, how we wanted to educate people. And, we have this really cool conference. It's the Novel Tech and Gene Therapy Workshop. And we bring together researchers from all over the world and they present their findings and they get to spend time with each other and ask questions. It's just the coolest thing. And, we have been able to pull in some of our consumers to that meeting. And, it's interesting to me because the consumers come in and they talk about their own perspectives. And those researchers get to hear about what does this really mean to a person? I'm sitting in a lab with animal models, and what does this really mean? And they get to actually see how what they're working on could really impact a person. And depending on who you talk to, some people say, well, if this gene therapy is not going to get me into the normal range, I'm not interested. And then you have other people who are they have severe disease, and they've got less than 1% of a factor 8 or factor 9. And if you tell them, I can get you up to 5%. Well,
Right.
that's life changing because they no longer have to worry about spontaneous bleeding. They can do things and not have that worry. So I think it's a different perspective too. And so I think that's something that's really important that we learned as well. So it's, again, it's, different expectations. So if you look at a patient population, that has these amazing treatment options,
Mm-hmm.
we've got factor replacement therapy. We have, factor replacement therapies that are, they have extended and ultra half-lives that, people are only having to do one infusion a week. And even at that week point, that 7-day point, their factor levels are still like in the, they're great. They're in the mild range.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got those situations. You also have the bispecific antibody therapies, that sub-Q treatment option. Now we're moving into rebalancing agents, which will
Mm.
also be sub-Q products. So there's a lot of innovation, and there are really high expectations from the community. And so I
Yep.
think that's something that we have to, really think about too, with gene therapy, knowing that in the future, what we're seeing today, it's going to be very different in the future in terms of, products that last longer, that are more effective,
Right.
and also safer, probably.
I totally agree. I think that anyone who's, in the gene therapy field thinking about, hemophilias in general, has to take the full view, right? There are options for these patients. Sure, there are things that could be made better about those options, but we have to deliver products that meet a target product profile that is extremely safe and provides great benefit, because these patients are going to think through all the options available to them and be choosy,
Absolutely.
and they should.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, I've worked on teams where, they've got a new technology and they're like, oh, what about hemophilia as our first indication? And because we can measure the factor level, so we'll know if it's working, and it's just a blood draw. It's not like we have to, take someone's tissue out to measure the levels. And I think that the pressure should still be on, and maybe even more so for novel technologies where we don't understand fully the sort of safety profile of that tech, to deliver things that are going to make meaningful difference for patients with
Absolutely.
hemophilia.
Yeah. And, I stated that we have amazing products. Well, we do, but they're not perfect
Right.
and they don't work for everybody. We have a population of our patients, our community that has an inhibitor. And
Right.
so their products don't work. We just recently have subcutaneous products for people with hemophilia B. And then, if I think about women with bleeding disorders, gene therapy isn't indicated for women, as we know at this point in time. And we have a lot of women who are struggling to get diagnosed, let alone have
Mm,
treatment options. So we do have a lot of work to do in the community still, and we're very committed to that. And one other thing I just want to comment on too is that when we really started to get our foothold in gene therapy, one of the things that we really focused on was understanding our position in this space. And originally we thought, I think all of us thought, and that's the big we, that hemophilia was going to be first out of the gate. And
mm,
so we really were trying to figure out how are we going to make sure that we're providing educational materials and that whatever we do, say, create, is something that is not going to have downstream negative consequences for other rare diseases.
yeah.
So, if things don't go well with the hemophilia gene therapy, what does that mean for one of our rare diseases that they have nothing? They have no treatment option. We don't want to, we didn't want to do anything that would stifle innovation. And so again, that's something that we take very seriously as well. And my hope is that the work that has been done so far, regardless of outcomes, is great learning for other rare diseases. And that's something that I think is really cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we've reached the end of our time, but I get to ask my favorite question, which is if you could wave a wand, a magic wand, and fix one thing for gene therapy development, what would it be?
That's that's a really difficult question.
Yes. You can
If I have
you
to
can
just
have more than one if that helps.
I'm picking that one thing, I think for me it would be looking at not just, bleeding disorders, but looking at all rare disease, that gene therapy is becomes more mainstream as a treatment option.
Mm,
And, that we have a situation where these therapies are, that we find a way to make them more accessible, that we find a way to lower costs, to figure out this reimbursement situation with payers. I think that's
mm,
something that, if you build it, we can't always come, right? If we
right.
have all of these obstacles that we are trying to get over. And, we've done a lot of work in that area too, in BDF with trying to figure out different reimbursement options. So I think for me, I think that would be it, that things are more, this is a more mainstream treatment option. And the only way we're going to get there, I think, is if we figure out how to lower the cost, how to make it attractive for payers to reimburse them. And I
Hmm.
think both of those things will naturally happen if we figure out how to ensure that gene therapies are safe, they're effective, and they're long lasting. So they really are, really getting to that point where it could be considered a curative therapy as opposed to just a durable treatment option.
Right. You hit the nail on the head from my perspective. I think, and this actually segs into my favorite sort of desire for our community, which is for us to know how durable they are, we need to be publishing our long-term data. So, and
Right.
there's tons of really long-term data in the hemophilia space. So that's my one plea again to our community.
Absolutely. And I think you're going to continue to see that, that coming out. And I think too, just recognizing that these gene therapies are, while they may not be getting people into the normal range right now in 2025, they are, getting those levels to a point where it's a more manageable disorder. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Brendan Hayes, thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to the Empowering Patients Virtual Summit here in a few weeks. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you again for the opportunity.